She thought she knew him, a devoted husband, a loyal partner. But when a grieving widow discovers a crumpled motel receipt buried among her late husband's belongings, her world shatters. What starts as a simple question, "Why was he there?" unravels a chilling web of lies, betrayal, and crime that will leave you questioning how well we ever truly know the ones we love. Stay tuned, because this true crime story takes twists you won't believe, leading to a shocking truth that changes everything. The rain fell in thin, relentless sheets, drumming softly on the black umbrella Clara gripped tightly in her hands. She stood at the edge of the freshly turned soil, the scent of damp earth mingling with the faint trace of lilies that adorned the nearby headstone. Lance's name was etched in elegant, unforgiving stone. Loving husband, loyal friend. The words stared back at her, empty and cold, as if daring her to believe them. Clara's black dress clung uncomfortably to her, weighed down by the rain and the invisible heaviness she couldn't shake. Around her, the crowd murmured condolences, their voices a dull hum against her racing thoughts. Her mother-in-law, Eleanor, lingered near the grave, her face a mask of grief that seemed to harden when her eyes met Clara's. He was too good for this world, Eleanor had whispered earlier, the words laced with subtle blame. Clara hadn't responded. What was there to say? The funeral ended in slow waves of shuffling feet and whispered goodbyes. Clara remained rooted, staring at the grave as the last of the mourners disappeared into the distance. Her fingers tightened on the umbrella, her nails digging into the damp wooden handle. Something in her chest felt raw, unsteady. She should have felt sadness or anger or anything remotely close to closure. Instead, there was a quiet, gnawing voice inside her, an unease she couldn't name. Back at the house, the quiet was louder than the rain had been. The scent of coffee lingered in the air from the guests who had gathered earlier, but the mugs sat abandoned now, their contents cold and untouched. Clara's hands moved mechanically, tidying up, her mind elsewhere. The house felt too big, too silent without Lance. It had been theirs, a shared dream built on memories, laughter, and the small arguments that kept their love human. Now it was just hers, and the absence of his presence seemed to loom in every corner. She wandered into his study, a room she'd avoided in the days since his death. It felt intrusive, as though his things were still his alone, untouched by the finality of his absence. The desk was meticulously organized, his way of creating order in a world that often seemed chaotic. Clara's gaze fell on a small leather-bound notebook, half hidden beneath a stack of neatly arranged folders. She pulled it free, the smooth cover cool against her fingertips. The notebook wasn't the type Lance usually carried. He had preferred sleek modern journals, ones that matched his polished demeanor. This was different, worn, with faint creases along the spine, as though it had been handled many times. She opened it cautiously, the faint scent of paper and ink rising as she flipped through the pages. It wasn't a journal or a ledger. Instead, it held what seemed to be random notes, addresses, phone numbers, and dates. Clara frowned, her finger trailing over the ink. One date jumped out at her. She recognized it immediately. It was 2 months before Lance's death, a week he had claimed to be on a business trip. Next to the date was a name she didn't know. Haven's Inn. The words pulsed on the page, taunting her. Lance had always been transparent about his work, or so she'd believed. If Haven's Inn was a hotel, why hadn't he mentioned staying there? Why had he felt the need to keep it from her? Her stomach churned as she snapped the notebook shut, her mind racing. She found herself sitting at the kitchen table, the rain still drumming against the windows. The notebook lay in front of her, a silent challenge. Every instinct told her to leave it alone, to let sleeping truths lie. But something inside her, Something primal and aching refused to back down. She couldn't ignore the sinking feeling that had followed her since Lance's death. Her love for him had been real, but now she couldn't help but wonder if his had been the same. Clara spent the next day gathering herself, pushing through the motions of life as though nothing had changed. But the notebook haunted her, its presence a quiet but persistent shadow. By evening, she could no longer resist. She sat down with her laptop, typing Haven's Inn into the search bar. The results were underwhelming. An outdated website with grainy photos of a rundown motel on the outskirts of a neighboring town. The site listed cheap weekly rates and boasted little else. Lance, a man of refinement and taste, staying at a place like that? It didn't make sense. Clara stared at the screen, her mind a web of conflicting thoughts. She closed the laptop and leaned back in her chair, her eyes drifting to the rain-streaked window. She thought of Lance, of the way he used to look at her when they shared quiet moments, the way his hand had rested on hers when they spoke about the future. The man she had loved couldn't have been hiding something like this. And yet the notebook, the date and the address told a different story. The next morning, Clara made her decision. She left the house early, the grey sky mirroring her mood as she drove toward the motel. The drive felt longer than it was, the highway stretching endlessly before her. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly, her mind replaying every memory of Lance she could summon, searching for clues she might have missed. When she arrived, the motel was even bleaker in person. The faded sign buzzed faintly, its neon letters missing pieces. The parking lot was cracked and littered with cigarette butts, the air heavy with the smell of damp asphalt. Clara stepped out of the car, her heels clicking against the pavement as she made her way to the front desk. A young woman sat behind the counter, her hair pulled into a messy bun, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. She looked up as Clara approached, her expression wary. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her voice flat but polite. Clara hesitated, her carefully rehearsed words faltering under the weight of the moment. "I'm looking for some information," Clara began, her voice steadier than she felt, "about a man who might have stayed here. Lance Harrington." The woman's face didn't change, but her posture shifted slightly, her hands moving to clasp the edge of the desk. "We get a lot of guests," she said, her tone cautious. "What's this about?" Clara felt the edges of her composure fraying. She leaned forward, her voice lowering. "I just need to know if you remember him. Please, it's important." The woman hesitated, her eyes flicking to the register beside her. For a moment, Clara thought she might refuse, but then she nodded slightly. "Wait here." As the woman disappeared into a back room, Clara's heart pounded in her chest. She glanced around the dim lobby, taking in the threadbare carpet and faded wallpaper. The place felt suffocating, a far cry from the life she and Lance had built together. And yet, something about it felt eerily significant, as though it held answers to questions she wasn't ready to ask. When the woman returned, she carried a ledger, the pages yellowed and curling at the edges. She set it on the counter and opened it, her finger skimming down a column of names. "Harrington, you said?" Clara nodded, her breath catching as the woman's fingers stopped. "Yeah, he was here," she said, glancing up. "Stayed for a few nights a couple months back. Paid in cash." Clara's stomach dropped. "Cash?" Lance never paid in cash. She tried to keep her expression neutral, but the woman's sharp eyes seemed to pick up on her unease. "Is there anything else?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman hesitated again, then shook her head. "That's all I can tell you. Sorry." Clara nodded, but her mind was already racing. She thanked the woman and turned to leave, her thoughts swirling with questions she couldn't answer. As she stepped outside, the cold air hit her like a slap, sharp and unforgiving. She paused, staring out at the grey horizon, the motel looming behind her like a shadow. Something wasn't right, and Clara knew she wouldn't stop until she uncovered the truth. Clara didn't sleep that night. The motel, the ledger, the nagging uncertainty, everything twisted together in her mind like a knot she couldn't untangle. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of Lance's name on the motel registry danced in her head, mocking her. What was he doing there? Why hadn't he mentioned it? Was there something more to his death than a simple car accident? She had to know. She had to. The next morning, Clara sat in the kitchen, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rim of her coffee mug. Her reflection in the dark liquid seemed almost foreign, as though she was staring at someone else. Someone driven by something darker than mere curiosity. She had always trusted Lance. They had built their life together, a life she thought was built on trust. But the more she dug, the more the foundation seemed to crack. What was it he had been hiding, and why? Was it just a fling with some woman at a rundown motel, or was there something more sinister at play? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. Clara frowned, glancing at the clock. It was early. She stood and walked slowly to the door, her pulse quickening. When she opened it, she wasn't surprised to see Eva, the maid from the motel, standing in the rain. The young woman's eyes were wide, her hair damp from the downpour, and her hands trembled as she clutched her purse. "Clara," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "can I come in?" Clara hesitated for only a moment before stepping aside, her heart thudding in her chest. "What's this about?" she asked, closing the door behind Eva as the woman quickly stepped into the warmth of the hallway. Eva looked nervous, her gaze darting around the room as though she were unsure of her own safety. She wrung her hands together, not meeting Clara's eyes. I don't know how to say this," Eva began, her voice shaking, "but I think I owe you an explanation." Clara's breath hitched. She motioned for Eva to sit at the kitchen table, her own mind racing. She had thought about this moment for hours, wondered what Eva would say when she finally came forward. "Start at the beginning," Clara said, her voice steady but laced with an edge of suspicion. Eva nodded, her fingers still trembling as she clasped them together on the table. She took a long, steadying breath before she spoke. "I wasn't just working at the motel. I knew Lance. I knew him in a way I shouldn't have." She swallowed hard, her eyes brimming with emotion. "He was good to me. Too good. And I thought I could trust him. But things got complicated." Clara's heart pounded in her chest. Too good. That wasn't what she had expected to hear. She sat down opposite Eva, her gaze fixed on the young woman, desperate for answers. "Complicated how?" Eva hesitated, her fingers trembling as she gripped the edge of the table. "He told me he was married. He said he loved you, but he also said he needed someone else, someone who didn't ask questions, someone who wouldn't care about his secrets, and that's where I came in." She stopped, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't know the truth about him, not until it was too late." Clara felt a cold knot settle in her stomach. Someone else. She had known there had to be more to Lance's relationship with Eva than a simple affair, but the way Eva spoke, so matter-of-factly, almost as if she were trying to justify the pain, made Clara's stomach turn. "What kind of secrets?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Eva's lips trembled as she lowered her gaze. I didn't know he was in trouble. Not at first, but then I found out. Lance was mixed up in something bad, something dangerous. He tried to keep it from me, but I saw the signs. The way he'd get calls in the middle of the night, the men who came and went from the motel, their suits, their cold stares. It wasn't just a hotel. It was a front for something much darker. Lance was involved with them, and I think he wanted out, but I think they They didn't want him to leave. Clara's mind reeled. Something dangerous? Lance had always seemed so clean-cut, so respectable. The very idea of him being tangled up in criminal activity felt impossible, like a story from someone else's life. And yet, here was Eva, shaking with fear, revealing secrets Clara never could have imagined. "Why didn't you tell me?" Clara's voice cracked, the question escaping before she could stop it. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner? You knew what was going on and you didn't say a word." Her words were sharper than she intended, the hurt of the betrayal cutting through the layers of suspicion. Eva flinched, but didn't look away. "I didn't want to get involved," she said, her voice thick with regret. "I didn't want to be in any more danger, but when I found out about his death, I knew I couldn't just keep quiet anymore. I thought maybe you deserved to know, maybe you could help him." Clara felt her heart skip a beat. "Help him," she repeated, the idea feeling foreign, strange. "Help him? After everything? He's dead, Eva. He's gone." Eva's face crumpled and she let out a shaky breath. "I know, but I think they killed him, Clara. I think they murdered him to keep him quiet." Clara recoiled, her breath catching in her throat. Murdered? The word felt like a slap in the face. Lance, the man she had loved, the man she had trusted with everything, was not just dead. He had been silenced by forces beyond his control. The implications hit her like a wave, threatening to drown her in their cold, cruel weight. "Who?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Who did this?" Eva's hands twisted in her lap. She glanced nervously toward the door, as though expecting someone to burst in at any moment. "I don't know who they are," she said, her voice barely audible. "But I know what they do. They run a syndicate. Money laundering, racketeering, things like that. Lance was involved. I don't know how deep, but he wanted out. And when he tried to leave, they—" Eva's voice trailed off, her expression pained. "I think they knew he was trying to talk to the police. They knew he was planning to expose them." Clara sat back in her chair, her mind racing. She had never considered the possibility that Lance had been involved in something so dark, so dangerous. The idea that he had been living a double life, hiding this from her, was unfathomable. And yet, here was Eva, a terrified witness to the secret Lance had kept from everyone, even from her. The world she had built with him was collapsing, piece by piece, revealing a truth far uglier than she had ever imagined. Clara stood abruptly, her hands gripping the edge of the table for support. "I need to know everything," she said, her voice firm, her resolve hardening with each passing second. "Everything. You're going to help me find out who did this to him." Eva looked up at her, her face a mixture of fear and relief. "I'll help. I will, but I don't know how much longer I'll be safe." She hesitated. "They're watching me too, watching both of us." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. The stakes were higher now. Lance's death wasn't just an accident. It was part of something much larger, and it was only a matter of time before the people behind it realized Clara was getting closer to the truth. But there was no turning back now. For better or worse, Clara was already in too deep. The game had changed, and she wasn't going to stop until she uncovered every last secret Lance had kept from her. Clara's every move felt under a microscope. Eva's warnings lingered in her thoughts as she drove back home, the afternoon light filtering through the trees in hazy streaks. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage, a place filled with memories of a man she thought she knew. The thought of Lance's secrets, his involvement in dangerous games, twisted inside her, each layer more suffocating than the last. She paced through the house, replaying Eva's words in her head. The deeper she delved, the more she realized how little she truly understood about Lance. How many lies had he told her, and what else was hidden in the shadows? The gnawing sense of betrayal she felt for him shifted into a kind of rage. How dare he drag her into this, even after death? How dare he keep her in the dark? She needed answers, but the more she thought about Eva's statement, "They're watching me too," the more Clara realized that she wasn't just searching for the truth about Lance's death. She was now part of a much bigger game, one she had never signed up for, and if she wasn't careful, she might become just another casualty. As night fell, Clara pulled out the old leather-bound notebook again, its pages trembling in her hands. The list of names, the addresses, the strange references, all of it was a puzzle, and she was determined to solve it. She started by going through the names on the pages once more. One of them stood out: Victor Reed. It had been scribbled beneath a date that coincided with Lance's last trip to Haven's Inn. Clara's heart raced as she Googled the name. Victor Reed was not a name she recognized. The search results brought up a few articles about a wealthy entrepreneur involved in various high-end real estate deals. Nothing too alarming at first glance, but the deeper she went, the darker the rabbit hole became. Victor Reed wasn't just a businessman. He was tied to a web of shell companies, untraceable transactions, and, more troublingly, a series of unsolved disappearances in several states. The pieces clicked together in a horrifying way. Lance had been involved with him, someone whose business dealings weren't just questionable, but criminal. Her stomach twisted as she read through the articles, each one more incriminating than the last. She had to know how Lance had gotten involved with him. But how? Why? What had they been planning? Clara's phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a text from Eva. "I think I've seen someone following you. Be careful." Clara's blood ran cold. She glanced out the window, scanning the street. Nothing appeared out of the ordinary, but the sensation of being watched crept up her spine like a whisper, an unsettling truth settling into her bones. They know, Clara realized. They know I'm asking questions, and they won't stop until they silence me too. Her mind raced. She couldn't do this alone. She needed someone to help her, someone she could trust. But who? Eleanor, Lance's mother, was still playing the grieving widow, but Clara wasn't convinced she knew nothing about her son's life. And then there was the detective, Jason Hill, who had been involved with the investigation into Lance's death. He had always seemed professional, straightforward, until Clara had started questioning the details of Lance's accident. Something about the way he'd deflected her questions had never quite sat right. Clara grabbed her phone and dialed his number, her fingers trembling. The call rang twice before Jason picked up. Detective Hill. His voice was steady as always. "Jason," Clara said, her voice tight, "I need to ask you about Lance's accident. I've been looking into it, and there's something I don't understand." There was a long pause. She could almost hear the hesitation on the other end of the line. "Clara, you should leave this alone. You've been through a lot. Lance's death." He trailed off, but she didn't need him to finish. She could hear the subtle warning in his voice. "I don't believe it was an accident," Clara said, her voice firm. "I think Lance was murdered, and I think you know something about it." Another pause. This time it was longer. Clara's pulse pounded in her ears as she waited for a response. Finally, Jason spoke, his voice quieter now. "You're treading dangerous ground, Clara. There are things you don't understand. Let it go." "Not until I know the truth," Clara snapped back. "If you're involved in covering this up—" "I'm not involved," he interrupted sharply. "But you're getting too close, Clara. For your own safety, you need to stop. Don't make this harder than it has to be." The call ended abruptly. Clara stared at her phone, her breath coming in short bursts. She had known deep down that there was more to his warning than simple concern. He knows something. I'm not crazy. This is real. But how far could she push before it became too dangerous? The night dragged on in uneasy silence. Clara sat in the darkened living room, every creak and sigh of the house amplified in her mind. She couldn't trust Jason, and she certainly couldn't trust the people behind Lance's death. But there was still one thing she hadn't done, one final desperate lead to follow. The address from the motel ledger, the one she hadn't dared visit, loomed in her mind. She had been to Haven's Inn, but it wasn't just a hotel. There was another address on the page, the one Lance had written down days before his death. "No more secrets," Clara whispered to herself. "This is it. This is the key." It was a warehouse, somewhere near the docks. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she ran the address through her phone. It was real, all right. A quiet part of the city, isolated, industrial, perfect for hiding something no one was meant to find. Clara knew what she had to do. The fear gnawing at her was palpable, but there was no turning back now. She was already in too deep. The truth was waiting, buried in the shadows, and Clara was willing to risk everything to uncover it. But she was also aware, more than ever, that the moment she stepped into that warehouse, the game would change. She wouldn't be an innocent widow looking for closure anymore. She would be a threat, and threats didn't get second chances. Before the sun rose, Clara was already preparing. It wasn't just about Lance anymore. It was about survival. The streets were empty at this hour, the world still heavy with the weight of pre-dawn silence. Clara's car hummed through the city, the headlights cutting through the fog as she headed toward the docks. The warehouse address, now seared into her memory, drew her like a magnet, the pull of unknown truths stronger than the lingering fear that churned in her gut. Every turn she made felt like an entry into another world, one where she was no longer a grieving wife, but a woman on the edge of something dangerous, something bigger than herself. The city was just waking up, the skyline outlined against a faint, bruised sky. Clara's knuckles were white as she gripped the steering wheel, her mind replaying the events of the past few days. Each new piece of the puzzle had brought her closer to the edge. Victor Reed, Lance's connection to him, Eva's desperate confession, Detective Hill's veiled threats. And now this, a derelict warehouse tucked away on the outskirts of town, far from prying eyes. She had driven this route before, but never with this kind of purpose. The docks had always been a place of unremarkable industry, the kind of place you drove through without much thought. Tonight, however, it felt like the mouth of some terrible beast, a place where things went to disappear, unseen by the world. As she neared the address, Clara slowed the car, the dimly lit streets giving way to towering shadowed structures. The warehouse loomed ahead, its windows blacked out, the metal door rusted and unwelcoming. A few cars were parked outside, their engines cold. No signs, no life. Just an eerie stillness that made Clara's breath hitch. She parked a block away, her pulse pounding in her ears. The air felt different here, thicker, more suffocating. She checked her phone, the screen glowing in the darkness, and double-checked the address. It matched. This was it. But something, some primal instinct, warned her not to go inside, not to take that final step. But then, what choice did she have? Clara grabbed her bag, tucking the small flashlight she'd brought into her jacket pocket. She glanced once more at the looming building, its outline barely visible in the dark. Her steps were quiet, measured, as she made her way toward the back entrance, avoiding the front where the few cars were parked. There was a shadow of movement, a flicker at the corner of her eye, and her breath caught. Had she been spotted already? She ducked behind a stack of crates, her heart racing as the sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. A lone figure passed by, but it wasn't anyone she recognized. The coast was clear. Clara moved quickly now, her body tense as she approached a narrow side door. It was slightly ajar. She paused, listening. All she could hear was the rhythmic hum of distant machinery and the occasional creak of metal. The cold air wrapped around her like a cloak, but she pushed forward, her fear giving way to a surge of adrenaline. The door creaked open under her hand, revealing the dim, cavernous interior of the warehouse. The smell of rust and chemicals filled the air, the space sprawling in every direction, empty except for shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. The concrete floor was covered in dust, and broken crates were scattered about haphazardly, as though abandoned long ago. But it wasn't the emptiness that held her attention. It was the faint light at the far end of the warehouse. Clara moved silently toward it, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the darkness. As she drew closer, the sound of muffled voices reached her ears, their words indistinguishable but distinct, low and urgent. Her heartbeat quickened. She wasn't alone. Carefully, she edged closer, finding a small gap between two crates that offered a clear view of the activity. Her breath caught in her throat. There were men, 3 of them standing in a circle, talking. One of them was tall, with broad shoulders and a face she didn't recognize. The second, a man with a hard, angular jaw and dark sunglasses that hid his eyes, seemed to be in charge. The third man was younger, nervous, shifting his weight from foot to foot, his hand twitching near his waist. They were all dressed in dark suits, and they looked out of place here, like predators in a hunting ground. And then Clara saw him. Standing in the shadows, his back turned, was a man she knew all too well. Victor Reed. Her breath caught in her throat as she squinted in disbelief. There he was, the man whose name had haunted her every search, whose shadow seemed to lurk behind Lance's death. He was the last person she'd ever expected to find in a place like this, standing in the middle of a warehouse, conversing with men who looked like they were straight out of a crime novel. Victor turned slightly, and Clara's pulse spiked. He was speaking in a low voice, his words clipped and sharp. Even from this distance, she could sense the tension in the room, the weight of the conversation. "I don't care how much he promised," Victor said, his voice cold, almost indifferent. "If Harrington wanted out, we had to take care of it. We're not going to risk him opening his mouth." The words hit Clara like a slap. Harrington. The name was unmistakable. Lance. They had killed him because he wanted out, because he was a liability. Her heart pounded in her chest as the weight of what she was hearing sank in. It wasn't just a secret life. It was a death sentence. One Lance had been trying to escape, only to be crushed by the very people he thought he could escape from. The younger man spoke, his voice shaking. "But he was going to go to the cops, Victor. He knew too much. I don't know if we can trust—" Victor cut him off, his voice sharp. "You'll trust me, or you'll end up like him. Understood?" The young man stammered, and the tension in the air thickened. Clara wanted to move, to flee, but she was frozen in place, her mind reeling, trying to process the conversation unfolding before her. This wasn't just about Lance's betrayal. This was a syndicate, a criminal organization that didn't play by the rules, and they were dangerous. Suddenly, one of the men turned in her direction, his eyes scanning the shadows. Clara froze, holding her breath, praying that she had not been seen. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The air hung heavy with the threat of discovery, but then the man turned back, and the conversation continued, the sound of Victor's voice now muffled and indistinct in the distance. Clara's pulse thudded in her ears. She couldn't stay here any longer. She had heard enough, and now she had to get out before they realized someone was eavesdropping. But as she turned to retreat, the floor creaked beneath her. The young man with the sunglasses glanced over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing. "Did you hear that?" Clara's heart skipped a beat. Her only choice was to run. She turned on her heel, her feet flying as she darted back the way she came, her mind screaming at her to get out, get to safety. The adrenaline surged through her veins as she reached the door, but as her fingers grasped the handle, it slammed shut. Her breath caught in her throat. Trapped. Behind her, the footsteps were coming closer. She turned, eyes wild, and saw a figure moving toward her. One of the men, his face a cold mask of determination. And in that moment, Clara understood. She wasn't just a widow searching for answers anymore. She had become a target, and the game had just turned deadly. Clara's chest heaved as she pressed her back against the cold metal door, her mind racing for a way out. The figure moved closer, his boots striking the concrete floor with deliberate, menacing force. The shadowed warehouse suddenly felt suffocating, the empty space amplifying the sound of each approaching step. Her flashlight was off now, clutched tightly in her trembling hands, the darkness around her swallowing every detail. She glanced to her right, searching for a hiding spot, an escape route, anything. A stack of crates sat a few feet away, their shadows blending into the dim light from the far corner of the warehouse. Without thinking, she bolted for them, her steps silent as she willed her body to disappear into the gloom. The man's voice echoed through the space, calm but chilling. "You can come out now," he called, his tone steady, almost casual. "We don't have to make this messy, just a little chat, that's all." Clara crouched behind the crates, her pulse hammering in her ears. Her mind raced, replaying the words she had overheard. Victor Reed's cold dismissal of Lance's life, the younger man's stammering fear. It all fit together like a terrible puzzle. Lance had been running, but there had been nowhere to hide. And now, it seemed, neither did she. The footsteps stopped, and the silence that followed was somehow worse. Clara held her breath, her body trembling. She knew better than to make a sound, but the weight of the tension was unbearable. Her fingers brushed the side of one of the crates, the rough wood splintering beneath her touch. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to stay still. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," the voice continued, now closer. "You think we don't know who you are, Clara Harrington. We know everything about you, about your husband, and we know why you're here." Her blood ran cold. They knew her name. They had been watching her, just as Eva had warned. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but fear kept her frozen. Her mind flicked back to the text Eva had sent, the message that had set her nerves on edge. "They're watching me too." Eva had been right. They were everywhere, always one step ahead. The sound of a phone buzzing shattered the silence. Clara stiffened, realizing it wasn't hers. It was coming from the man. He answered it, his voice lowering as he spoke to whoever was on the other end. The words were muffled, but she caught fragments. "She's here. Yes, I'll handle it. No loose ends." Clara's breath hitched. No loose ends. The man ended the call, and the sound of his footsteps resumed, circling closer to her hiding spot. She clutched the flashlight tighter, her palms slick with sweat. Her only chance was to move, quickly, silently, before he reached her. She scanned the area, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. To her left, there was a narrow gap between the crates and the wall. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to slip through. The moment he turned away, Clara made her move. She slid into the gap, her body pressed tightly against the cold wall. The sound of her own breathing was deafening as she inched forward, praying he wouldn't hear her. Every step felt like an eternity, her heart threatening to give her away. And then she saw it, a narrow staircase leading to the upper level. The faint glow of an office light spilled out from a glass-paneled door above. Clara's stomach twisted. An office meant files, records, something tangible to connect the dots. She hesitated, torn between the instinct to flee and the burning need to uncover the truth. The man's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Last chance, Clara. We know you're here. You're not getting out of this building without us finding you." Her decision was made. She bolted up the stairs, her footsteps light but quick, the creak of the metal steps barely audible over the pounding in her chest. She reached the top and slipped into the office, closing the door quietly behind her. The room was small, cluttered with stacks of papers, a desk covered in loose files, and a glowing laptop screen. A quick scan of the room revealed no immediate threats. She moved quickly, her hands trembling as she rifled through the papers. Invoices, shipping manifests, bank records, it was all there. Names she didn't recognize, numbers that meant nothing to her, but one name kept appearing over and over. Victor Reed. The documents detailed payments, transactions, and coded references to operations that seemed far from legal. Clara's eyes caught a specific line on one page. Harrington, final payment processed. Her stomach turned. Final payment? The sound of the door rattling jolted her. Someone was trying to get in. She grabbed the laptop, tucking it under her arm, and backed away toward the other side of the room. The door burst open, and the man in the dark suit stepped inside, his eyes scanning the space. He spotted her instantly, and a smirk spread across his face. "You've got guts," he said, stepping closer. "I'll give you that." Clara's mind screamed for an escape, but the room had no windows, no second door. She clutched the laptop tighter, her free hand fumbling for the flashlight in her pocket. The man moved slowly, as if savoring the moment. "You think you're going to get away with this?" he said, his voice low and menacing. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" Clara's fingers found the flashlight, and she gripped it tightly. She didn't answer. Her eyes flicked to the desk, where a heavy metal paperweight sat. If she could just... The man lunged, and Clara acted on instinct. She swung the flashlight, catching him across the face. He stumbled back, cursing, and she grabbed the paperweight, throwing it at him with all her strength. It hit his shoulder, and he let out a grunt of pain. Clara darted past him, clutching the laptop as she bolted down the stairs. The warehouse was alive now, the sound of shouting echoing behind her. More footsteps, more voices. Clara's chest burned as she ran, her legs pumping as fast as they could carry her. She burst through the side door and into the cold night air, the city lights a distant blur. She didn't stop, not until she was back in her car, the engine roaring to life as she sped away, her breath ragged and her hands trembling on the wheel. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from Eva. "Get out of town, now!" Clara gripped the steering wheel tighter, her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. Headlights appeared in the distance, following her, growing closer. They weren't going to let her go. She had the truth now, and they would do anything to bury it.